The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that falls over a crowd when a microphone cuts out, or when a host stumbles over a teleprompter. This was something different. The kind of quiet that arrives when a man who has spent 70 years saying very little finally opens his mouth and says something real. Clint Eastwood was on camera, and what he said stopped the room cold. To understand why that moment landed so hard, you first have to understand what kind of man Clint Eastwood has always been, and more importantly, what kind of man he has spent decades refusing to become. Born Clinton Eastwood Jr. on May 31st, 1930 in San Francisco, California, he came into the world during a period of national unraveling. The Great Depression was reshaping the country, and his family felt those pressures in the way most working families did. Through constant movement, uncertain income, and the quiet anxiety of a father whose hands could never quite hold on to steady work. His father, Clinton Eastwood Sr., moved through jobs, sales, manufacturing, labor, dragging the family from city to city, apartment to apartment, school to school. By the time the family finally settled in Piedmont, California in 1940, young Clint had already learned something that would define the rest of his life. Keep moving. Don't attach too hard to anything. And never let people see you struggling. Those lessons stayed with him. They stayed when he dropped out of one high school and finished at another. They stayed when he drifted through a string of jobs: lifeguard, grocery clerk, forest firefighter, steel worker, after graduation, with no plan and no particular direction. They stayed when he nearly drowned in the cold Pacific Ocean after a military plane crashed into the sea during a night flight in 1951, an event he later reduced to a single line: just another bad day. They stayed when he arrived in Los Angeles after his Army service ended in 1953, nearly broke, digging swimming pools by day and attending acting classes on the GI Bill by night. They stayed through rejection after rejection, through the Universal Studios contract that lasted less than 2 years before executives called him too stiff, too slow, too odd-looking. They stayed to the quiet, grinding years of Rawhide, a television western that made him famous but not respected, and through the spaghetti westerns with Sergio Leone that turned him into an international icon but still couldn't shake the sense, in Hollywood circles, that he was not to be taken seriously as a craftsman. All of that silence, all of that guardedness, all of that refusal to show the seams. It became his brand. The squinting, unhurried, emotionally unavailable man with the dangerous stillness. Audiences loved him for it. Critics misread him because of it, and the people closest to him paid a price for it. By the time Clint Eastwood arrived at the intersection of great age and public reckoning, the weight of what he had accumulated behind that composed exterior was considerable. 8 children with 6 different women. A daughter, Laurie, whose existence was kept hidden for nearly 40 years. An affair with actress Frances Fisher that produced daughter Francesca in 1993. 2 children with flight attendant Jacelyn Reeves. Scott in 1986 and Kathryn in 1988, whose birth records initially listed the father line as blank. A marriage to Maggie Johnson from 1953 to 1984 that produced Kyle and Alison. A marriage to television journalist Dina Ruiz from 1996 to 2014 that produced Morgan and ended in a tabloid-soaked separation. And then there was Sondra Locke, a legal battle so prolonged and damaging that it forced Hollywood to have conversations it was not prepared to have. After their breakup in 1989, Locke sued him for palimony. A subsequent fraud suit revealed that the development deal Locke had received at Warner Brothers, pitched to her as a generous second chance at a directing career, had secretly been funded through Eastwood himself, without her knowledge. She pitched more than 30 projects. Every one was rejected. The case settled before a final verdict in September 1996, but not before testimony confirmed that Eastwood had concealed the funding. The damage was already done. Her directing career never recovered. That legal saga was not the story of a monster, but it was a story of a man so accustomed to controlling the frame that he could not stop doing it even when the frame was someone else's life. For decades, Eastwood absorbed all of it behind that famous composure. He kept working. Unforgiven in 1992 for Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, rewrote his legacy in one stroke. The Bridges of Madison County in 1995 surprised critics who expected a misfire and left audiences quietly devastated. $1 Million Baby in 2004 won 4 Oscars and made him, at 74 years and 272 days, the oldest person ever to win the Academy Award for Best Director. Gran Torino in 2008, American Sniper in 2014, Sully in 2016, Richard Jewell in 2019, Cry Macho in 2021, and finally Juror Number 2 in 2024, shot at 93 years old, delivered to Warner Brothers, and then quietly buried in a release of roughly 28 to 35 screens nationwide. A film directed by one of the studio's most decorated filmmakers, treated like something to be hidden. Even that indignity he absorbed, but then came the losses that no amount of discipline could absorb. In July 2024, Christina Sandera died. She was 61. A cardiac arrhythmia, the death certificate confirmed, with atherosclerotic coronary artery disease as a contributing factor, as verified by the Monterey County Health Department. She and Clint had been together since 2014, meeting when she worked as a hostess at his Mission Ranch Hotel and Restaurant in Carmel by the Sea. They were never married, but she had been, by most accounts, the steadying presence in his later years. The person who could pull him out of the house. The person who kept the world from closing in. When Eastwood released a statement, it read in full, "Christina was a lovely, caring woman, and I will miss her very much." 12 words. The whole of a decade-long love reduced to 12 words, because that is how he was built. And at 94 years old, he was not going to be rebuilt. But something shifted. Observers began noticing the weight of it and how rarely he appeared. How much quieter the already quiet man had become. His son Scott, speaking to People magazine in early 2025, offered what reassurance he could. "He's doing good," Scott said. "He's a survivor, a trooper." And then, acknowledging something real beneath the reassurance, he saw a lot of struggle. Then, on February 27th, 2025, Gene Hackman was found dead in his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was 95. His wife, Betsy Arakoa, was found alongside him in a separate room. The circumstances were initially labeled suspicious by police, and the shock spread through Hollywood at a speed that even the industry's most practiced grief could not quite contain. For Clint Eastwood, it was something more personal. Hackman had starred in Unforgiven as Sheriff Little Bill Daggett, a performance so precise and so inhabited that it earned him a second Academy Award. He and Eastwood had worked together over decades, and the friendship had outlasted the films that made it visible. Eastwood's statement, released to Variety and Deadline, was brief. It was also, for him, remarkably unguarded. There was no finer actor than Gene. Intense and instinctive. Never a false note. He was also a dear friend whom I will miss very much. That last sentence was the tell, not the professional tribute, not the assessment of craft. Accurate as it was, the last sentence. A dear friend whom I will miss very much. From a man who had spent most of his public life refusing to publicly miss anything. That sentence said everything about where he had arrived. The television moment arrived in a context that felt unremarkable at first. Eastwood, who turned 95 on May 31st, 2025, had become, by that point, a man who had outlived nearly everyone who had once stood beside him. The Rawhide cast, his longtime collaborators, his peers from the Leone films, his fellow veterans from the early studio era, Gene Hackman, Christina Sandera. The list stretched back to 1966, when Eric Fleming, his co-star on Rawhide, drowned in a river in Peru during location work, a loss that had stayed with Eastwood for almost 6 decades without ever becoming part of his public conversation. He had also spent the year dealing with misinformation. An Austrian publication, Courier, had published what appeared to be a new interview with Eastwood, filled with sharp remarks about Hollywood's addiction to remakes and franchises, and a declaration that he was already in pre-production on a new film. The piece went viral. Entertainment outlets republished it globally. Audiences read it as proof that Eastwood was still alive, still sharp, still swinging. Then, on June 1st, 2025, he set the record straight through Deadline. The interview was entirely fabricated. He had never spoken to the publication. An Austrian journalist later clarified that the quotes were in fact real, but pulled from HFPA press conferences dating back decades, some as far as 1976, stitched together and presented as a current conversation. Courier pulled the article. The damage to clarity, however, was already done. It was in the middle of all of this, the grief, the misinformation, the encroaching stillness, the sense of man being slowly reduced to rumor and tabloid arithmetic, that the moment came. The setting was more intimate than a formal press junket, a live camera, a relatively small audience, and an interviewer who, by all accounts, understood they were sitting across from someone who did not waste words. The subject had circled around the loss, not abstractly, but specifically, who was gone, what that meant, what it felt like to be the one still here. And Eastwood, who had spent more than 70 years on camera, without once letting the mask fully slip, let it slip. He spoke about Gene Hackman. He said, in terms more direct than any statement released through a publicist, what it meant to lose a man like that, a man who showed up to every scene fully loaded, who never coasted, who understood that acting was not pretending but revealing. He said that the older you get, the smaller the circle becomes, and that nobody who hasn't lived it can understand what that arithmetic actually feels like. He spoke, carefully and without sentimentality, about Christina, about the particular silence of a house that used to have someone in it, about what it is to keep working when the reason for working had to be rebuilt from scratch. He said that he had not retired. He said it with a familiar firmness, but also with something underneath it. Not desperation, not performance, but a kind of earned insistence. I still have things to make. I still have more. And then he said something that stopped the room. He said that the hardest thing he had ever done was not any film, not the night he nearly drowned in the Pacific, not the years of rejection before Rawhide, not the legal battles or the public humiliations or the weight of an enormously complicated private life. The hardest thing he had ever done was to keep going when the people who made going feel meaningful were no longer there to see it. It was a short statement. He did not elaborate. He did not cry. His face did the same thing as always done, held, absorbed, processed without broadcasting. But the room went quiet, because what he had said was not a performance of grief. It was grief itself, wearing the only clothes he knew how to put on it. By the time Eastwood turned 96 on May 31st, 2026, the picture of his life had clarified into something that even he might not have predicted when he was a broke young man digging pools under the California sun. Sources close to him, including his son Scott, confirmed that he was living at what one described as an extremely gentle pace, splitting time between California and Hawaii, playing golf when his energy allowed, maintaining the habits that had carried him this far. A clean diet, daily transcendental meditation, a practice he had maintained since the 1970s, gentle movement, the discipline of a man who, as celebrity biographer Sean Levy, author of Clint, the man in the movies, put it, had always approached his body the way he approached the set, methodically, without waste. He was, by the account available, still in pre-production on a new film, still refusing to call juror number 2 his farewell, even as the industry around him had already begun writing that sentence, still insisting, in the way that only men shaped by a particular kind of stubbornness can insist, that the ending had not been written yet. He had said as much himself, in remarks that, whatever their original date, contained a sentiment his entire career had demonstrated to be true. There is no reason why a man cannot get better with age. Whether he would make another film, only time would answer, but what the camera had captured in that quiet, live moment was something more lasting than a film. It was the truth of a man who had spent his entire life constructing an image of invulnerability, and who had finally, in the narrowing circle of his 90s, allowed the audience to see what the image had always been protecting. Not coldness, not arrogance, not the mythologized silence of a man above feeling. Something much simpler and much harder to carry. A man who loved people he could not say he loved until they were gone, and who was now at 95, saying it anyway. The room went quiet because that kind of honesty from that particular man, in that particular moment, was worth every year of waiting to hear. Sources: Variety, Deadline, People, the Monterey County Health Department, The Hollywood Reporter, Fox News, Scott Eastwood interviews, People, Daily Express, celebrity biographer Sean Levy Clint, The Man in the Movies, GB News, 3DVF.com, Jackson Health System.